Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. In 1868, they came with open hands. Not guns, not greed, just hands, open, ready to shake. The Lakota elders watched these strangers emerge from their wagons and walk into the circle of lodges with something that looked remarkably like respect. They sat where they were invited to sit. They ate what was offered to them. They laughed at stories told around fires that had burned for generations before their grandfathers were even born. The strangers spoke words that sounded important. Words like treaty and brotherhood and lasting peace. They spoke them slowly, carefully, as if they understood the weight of such promises. The Lakota leaders listened, nodded and believed them. Because in their world, when someone spoke a promise, it meant something. When someone shared your fire and ate your food, they became part of something larger than themselves. They became family in a way, or at least, that's how it was supposed to work. The men in uniform spread maps across buffalo hides and pointed to lines drawn with ink. These lines, they explained, would keep everyone safe, everyone happy. The Lakota would have their land, vast stretches of prairie and forest, and the sacred black hills that rose from the plains like sleeping giants. The Americans would have their railroads and their settlements, but over there, in designated places, with boundaries everyone agreed upon, it felt reasonable. It felt possible. It felt like the kind of arrangement that grown people make when they want to share a world without stepping on each other's feet. The Lakota chiefs studied those maps carefully, asked questions, made suggestions. They wanted to understand every detail because they knew their children and their children's children would live with whatever was decided in those smoky lodges during those long nights of negotiation. Some of the American negotiators seemed genuinely moved by Lakota hospitality. They commented on the generosity, the wisdom of the elders, the beauty of the land they were being shown. A few even learned some Lakota words, attempted to understand the spiritual significance of certain places. They nodded solemnly when told about the sacred nature of the Black Hills, about ancestors buried in those peaks, about ceremonies that had taken place there since time immemorial. These weren't the faces of conquerors. These were the faces of neighbors, potentially. People who might understand that the world was big enough for different ways of living, different relationships with the land, different definitions of wealth and success. The handshakes felt firm. The eye contact felt honest. The promises felt real. Of course, what the Lakota leaders didn't know then, couldn't have known, was how quickly promises could be forgotten when something shinier came along. They didn't know that peace for some people was only valuable until something more valuable was discovered underneath it. They didn't know that forever was a word with a surprisingly flexible definition when the right people got together in the right rooms, far away from the fires where the original promises were made. They believed in the handshakes because they had to, because the alternative, perpetual war with an enemy that kept growing larger and more numerous, wasn't really an alternative at all. Because their children deserved a chance to grow up in a world where different peoples could coexist without constantly looking over their shoulders for the next attack, the next betrayal, the next broken promise. So they shook hands, they signed papers, they shared meals and stories, and hopes for a future that seemed, in those moments, genuinely possible. They went to sleep in their lodges thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way to preserve what mattered most to them, while allowing these newcomers to build whatever it was they needed to build. But peace, as it turned out, was a luxury that lasted only as long as the land beneath it remained unremarkable. Only as long as no one discovered that those sacred hills contained something that glittered. Only as long as friendship mattered more than gold. The Lakota elders had made their choice in good faith, with open hearts and careful consideration. They had chosen to trust in human decency, in the power of shared meals and honest conversation to bridge differences between peoples. They had chosen to believe that promises made in front of witnesses, written down on paper, sealed with ceremony and celebration, would be honored. It was a beautiful choice, a hopeful choice, a choice that said something profound about their faith in the possibility of human cooperation and mutual respect. It was also, as they would learn, a choice that left them heartbreakingly vulnerable to people who viewed promises as temporary conveniences rather than sacred bonds. The Black Hills were never just land to the Lakota. They were the backbone of the world, the place where earth met sky in a conversation that had been going on since the beginning of time. Every pine tree, every stream, every stone outcropping held stories that had been passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. These hills were where young people went to seek visions, where elders went to commune with ancestors, where the very rocks seemed to commune with ancestors. When the American negotiators first arrived in 1868, some of the Lakota leaders took them into the hills to help them understand what they would be promising to protect. They walked the sacred paths together, the Lakota explaining the significance of certain places, the Americans nodding and asking respectful questions. Some seemed genuinely moved by the beauty of the landscape, the way morning mist clung to the pine forests, the way evening light turned the granite peaks into something that looked almost supernatural. The Americans listened to stories about how the hills were formed, about the spirits that lived there, about the responsibility that came with caring for such a sacred place. They took notes, made sketches, asked to hear certain stories repeated so they could understand them better. A few even participated in ceremonies, following protocols they didn't fully understand, but approached with apparent sincerity. It felt like understanding was possible, like these strangers might actually comprehend that the Black Hills weren't just another piece of real estate to be bought and sold and carved up for profit. Like they might recognize that some things were worth more than money, more valuable than whatever resources might be extracted from them. But then, 6 years later in 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer arrived with his geological expedition, and suddenly everything changed. Custer wasn't interested in stories or ceremonies, or the spiritual significance of ancient stone formations. Custer was interested in what his geologists found glittering in the streams and embedded in the rocks. Custer was interested in gold. The discovery spread like wildfire through American newspapers and mining camps. "Gold in the Black Hills," the headlines screamed. "Fortunes waiting to be claimed. The richest discovery since California." Suddenly, those sacred peaks weren't sacred anymore. They were just sparkly. They were opportunity. They were the answer to every prospector's dreams and every struggling family's prayers. The Lakota watched in growing alarm as the news spread and the first unauthorized expeditions began probing the edges of their territory. They reported these illegal incursions to their government contacts, reminding them of the treaties, the promises, the boundaries that had been so carefully negotiated and documented. The response was always the same. "We'll look into it. We're aware of the situation. We're doing everything we can to prevent unauthorized access." But the unauthorized access kept happening, and the government's efforts to prevent it seemed remarkably ineffective for an organization that could move armies across continents when it wanted to. It was almost as if they were trying just hard enough to say they had tried, but not quite hard enough to actually succeed. The Lakota began to understand that their American friends faced a problem. On one hand, they had made promises, signed treaties, given their word that the Black Hills would remain inviolate. On the other hand, they now knew there was gold in those hills. Lots of gold. Life-changing, economy-boosting, politically significant amounts of gold. And gold, as it turned out, had a way of making people forget about inconvenient promises they had made to inconvenient people who weren't voters or campaign contributors or members of the same social clubs. The first miners arrived like a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. They came with shovels and pickaxes and an absolute certainty that the rules didn't apply to them. They came with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing that the government that was supposed to stop them was also the government that really, really wanted them to succeed. Each new camp, each new mine, each new settlement was built on land that belonged to the Lakota according to every legal document that had been signed by both parties. But legality, apparently, was a flexible concept when applied to sacred hills full of precious metals. The Lakota found themselves in the impossible position of watching their most sacred places being desecrated by people who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to wealth. The hills that had sung to them for generations were now being blasted with dynamite and washed with chemicals and carved up with mechanical precision. The trees where their ancestors had sought visions were being cut down to build mining equipment. The streams where they had performed purification ceremonies were being poisoned with mercury and cyanide. The very stones that held their history were being crushed and processed and shipped away to become someone else's fortune. And through it all, their American friends kept assuring them that something would be done, that the situation was temporary, that the government was working on a solution that would satisfy everyone involved. The hills kept singing, but now their song had changed. Now, it sounded less like ancient wisdom and more like a lament, a mourning song for something beautiful that was being destroyed by people who couldn't hear its music. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, the same document that had emerged from those careful negotiations in 1868, wasn't just a piece of paper. It was supposed to be a sacred covenant between nations, witnessed by representatives of both peoples, sealed with ceremony and solemnity. The document was carefully written in clear language that left little room for misinterpretation. It established the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, as territory that would belong to the Lakota for as long as the grass grows and the water flows. The treaty negotiations had taken weeks. Lakota leaders had insisted on understanding every clause, every boundary, every implication of what they were agreeing to. They had brought their own interpreters to make sure nothing was lost in translation. They had asked questions, demanded clarifications, suggested modifications. This wasn't a document that had been rushed through or signed under duress. This was a carefully considered agreement between two sovereign peoples who were trying to find a way to coexist peacefully. The American negotiators had seemed to understand the gravity of what they were promising. They spoke about the permanence of the arrangement, about their government's commitment to honoring its word, about the importance of maintaining peaceful relations between their peoples. Some had even expressed admiration for Lakota culture and values, suggesting that this treaty represented a new kind of relationship, based on mutual respect rather than conquest. The treaty was ratified by the United States Senate. It became the law of the land, as binding as any other federal legislation. It was printed, distributed, filed in official archives. It existed in multiple copies in multiple locations, witnessed by dozens of officials and leaders from both sides. There was nothing ambiguous about its terms, or tentative about its status as binding law. For a few years, it seemed to work. The boundaries were respected, more or less. The Lakota maintained their traditional ways of life within the reservation boundaries, while American settlers and military personnel stayed on their side of the lines. There were occasional tensions, minor incidents, misunderstandings that required diplomatic resolution, but nothing that couldn't be handled through the proper channels. But then came Custer's expedition in 1874, and the discovery of gold, and suddenly the treaty became what government officials like to call problematic. Not illegal, mind you, not invalid, just problematic, inconvenient, an obstacle to what some people had begun calling progress and economic development and manifest destiny. The first attempts to modify the treaty were surprisingly direct. Government officials approached Lakota leaders with offers to purchase the Black Hills. The numbers they suggested were substantial, millions of dollars, enough to provide for the Lakota people for generations. All they had to do was agree to sell their most sacred territory to people who wanted to dig it up and ship it away piece by piece. The Lakota response was unequivocal. The Black Hills were not for sale. Not for millions of dollars, not for any amount of money. Some things, they explained patiently, were worth more than money. Some places were too sacred to be reduced to mere financial transactions. The hills were not just land to be bought and sold. They were the spiritual center of Lakota existence. The government officials nodded and said they understood, but they kept coming back, with new offers, larger numbers, different arrangements. They seemed genuinely puzzled by the Lakota refusal to negotiate. After all, wasn't everything for sale at the right price? Wasn't money the universal language that could resolve any dispute? So when it became clear that the Lakota would not sell the Black Hills voluntarily, the government tried a different approach. They stopped enforcing the treaty. Not officially, of course. Officially, the treaty remained in full effect, and the government remained committed to its terms. But practically, enforcement became remarkably lax. Miners flooded into the Black Hills by the thousands. Military patrols that were supposed to remove trespassers seemed to get lost on the way to illegal mining camps. Government officials who were supposed to prosecute treaty violations discovered that their offices were suddenly understaffed and their budgets insufficient for aggressive enforcement. The Lakota found themselves in the surreal position of watching their treaty rights being violated on a massive scale, while government officials assured them that these violations were temporary, unauthorized, and certainly not reflective of official policy. The illegal mining camps grew into illegal towns. The illegal towns grew into illegal cities, but they remained officially temporary and unauthorized. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic creativity. The treaty remained legally valid, so the government could claim it was honoring its commitments, but the treaty was not being enforced, so miners and settlers could claim the land without interference. Everyone could maintain their preferred fiction, while the Black Hills were systematically stripped of their gold and their sanctity. The Lakota protested through official channels. They filed complaints, requested meetings, demanded that the government honor its legal obligations. The response was always the same: "We're looking into it. These are complex issues that require careful consideration. We remain committed to finding a solution that serves everyone's interests." But the solution that was emerging didn't serve everyone's interests. It served the interests of gold miners and land speculators and politicians who represented mining states. It served the interests of people who had never seen the Black Hills, never walked their sacred paths, never understood their significance beyond their mineral content. The treaty, that had been written to last as long as the grass grows and the water flows, was being forgotten in real time, erased, not by official repeal, but by systematic non-enforcement. It was still technically valid, but practically meaningless, like a marriage certificate for a couple that had stopped living together, legally binding but emotionally hollow. The Lakota kept their copies of the treaty, kept referring to its terms, kept believing that eventually justice would prevail and the law would be enforced. But with each passing month, each new mining camp, each ignored complaint, it became harder to maintain faith in a system that seemed to honor its promises only when honoring them was convenient. Starting in 1875, they came like a human avalanche, these gold seekers, not in ones or twos, but in waves that crashed against the Black Hills with relentless persistence. Miners, prospectors, merchants, gamblers, prostitutes, saloon keepers, hardware dealers, claim jumpers and con artists. An entire economy of opportunism that materialized almost overnight in places that had been wilderness just months before. The Black Hills gold rush of 1875-1876 brought an estimated 15,000 people into Lakota territory within the first year. They came from mining camps in Colorado and California, from farms in Iowa and Illinois, from cities in the East where newspaper stories about instant fortunes had captured imaginations and emptied bank accounts. They came with everything they owned loaded into wagons, ready to start new lives in a land that legally belonged to someone else. While legality was a luxury these fortune seekers couldn't afford to worry about, they had mortgaged their farms, sold their businesses, borrowed money from relatives, and invested their life savings in the dream of striking it rich. They couldn't afford to be stopped by technicalities like treaties or boundaries, or the fact that they were trespassing on a massive scale. The first camps were chaotic, desperate affairs. Deadwood Gulch, which would become the most famous of the mining towns, started as a collection of tents and crude shelters scattered along a creek where prospectors had found promising amounts of gold in the gravel. Within months, it had grown into a town of several thousand people, complete with saloons, general stores, hotels, and all the infrastructure necessary to separate miners from their gold as efficiently as possible. The Lakota watched this invasion with a mixture of amazement and horror. These weren't the careful, respectful negotiators who had signed treaties and made promises about permanent boundaries. These were desperate people who had travelled hundreds of miles to dig holes in sacred ground, and they weren't going to let anything as abstract as prior legal claims stop them from pursuing their dreams. The newcomers showed no interest in Lakota culture, spirituality, or legal rights. They saw the Black Hills as empty wilderness that was being wasted by people who didn't understand its true value. From their perspective, They were bringing civilization and economic development to a region that had been sitting unused for centuries. The cultural collision was jarring. The Lakota had a relationship with the land that was spiritual, sustainable, and based on taking only what was needed while leaving the fundamental character of the place unchanged. The miners had a relationship with the land that was extractive, temporary, and based on removing as much valuable material as possible in the shortest amount of time. Every tree that was cut to build mining equipment or heat mining camps was a tree that had been part of the sacred landscape for decades or centuries. Every stream that was diverted to wash gold-bearing gravel was a stream that had been part of ceremonial practices for generations. Every mountainside that was blasted with dynamite was a mountainside that had been considered the dwelling place of spirits. The environmental destruction was immediate and comprehensive. Hydraulic mining techniques washed away entire hillsides. Mercury and other toxic chemicals used in gold processing poisoned streams and groundwater. Forests were clear-cut to provide timber for mines and fuel for smelters. Wildlife was hunted to near extinction to feed the growing population of miners and merchants. But perhaps more disturbing than the environmental destruction was the casual violence that accompanied the gold rush. The mining camps were largely lawless places, where disputes were settled with guns rather than courts. Native Americans who tried to protect their territory or their sacred sites were shot on sight. Even peaceful encounters often ended in violence, as nervous miners assumed that any Indian presence was a threat to their operations. The Lakota found themselves driven from places that had been part of their territory for generations. Traditional hunting grounds became mining claims. Sacred sites became commercial operations. The trails their ancestors had walked for centuries became wagon roads serving the needs of an economy that viewed their presence as an obstacle to progress. They appealed to government officials, reminding them of treaty obligations and requesting military intervention to remove the trespassers. The responses were sympathetic but ineffective. Military commanders explained that they lacked sufficient troops to patrol such a large area. Indian agents acknowledged the violations but said they were powerless to stop them without additional resources and authority. Meanwhile, the mining camps kept growing. Deadwood became a city. Lead became a major commercial center. Rapid City emerged as a supply hub for the entire region. What had begun as a few scattered prospectors had become a permanent population that was economically and politically connected to the broader American economy. The transformation was irreversible, even if the government had wanted to honor its treaty obligations, which was becoming increasingly doubtful. The practical challenges of removing 15,000 people and dismantling entire cities would have been enormous. The gold rush had created facts on the ground that made the original treaty impossible to enforce. The Lakota found themselves witnessing the destruction of their sacred landscape and the violation of their legal rights on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. The hills that had sung to them for generations were now filled with the sounds of dynamite blasts and steam engines, and the constant noise of human greed, transforming a spiritual landscape into an industrial operation. And through it all, government officials continued to assure them that the situation was temporary, that solutions were being developed, that their rights would ultimately be protected. But the mines kept operating, the towns kept growing, and the sacred hills kept disappearing, one blast and one claim at a time. The legal battle for the Black Hills stretched across decades like a slow demission catastrophe, a judicial marathon that exhausted everyone involved while accomplishing almost nothing for the people whose rights had been violated. Court cases moved through the system with glacial speed, producing mountains of legal documents and years of testimony, while the mining operations they were supposed to address continued expanding and profiting. The initial lawsuits filed by the Lakota were straightforward in their claims. The United States government had signed a treaty guaranteeing permanent ownership of the Black Hills, then failed to enforce that treaty when enforcement became inconvenient. The legal remedy should have been equally straightforward: remove the trespassers and restore the land to its rightful owners. But the American legal system proved remarkably creative when it came to avoiding straightforward solutions to inconvenient problems. Judges discovered procedural issues that required years of additional litigation. Appeals courts found technical grounds for overturning decisions they didn't like. The Supreme Court agreed to hear cases, then took years to issue rulings that resolved nothing while appearing to address everything. The first major case to reach the Supreme Court was United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, which wasn't decided until 1980, more than a century after the original treaty violations began. The court's decision was a masterpiece of legal irony. They acknowledged that the taking of the Black Hills constituted a violation of the Fifth Amendment, essentially admitting that the government had committed theft on a massive scale. But instead of ordering the land returned, the court decided that the appropriate remedy was monetary compensation. The Lakota were awarded $17,500,000, 0 cents, for the original value of the Black Hills, plus interest calculated from 1877. With interest, the total award came to approximately $106 million, 0 cents. A substantial sum, but utterly meaningless to people who had never wanted money in the first place. The Lakota response was unequivocal. They refused the money. The Black Hills were not for sale in 1875, and they were not for sale in 1980. No amount of money could compensate for the loss of their sacred center, their spiritual homeland, the place where their ancestors were buried and their ceremonies were conducted. The money has been sitting in federal accounts ever since, earning interest and growing to hundreds of millions of dollars while remaining unclaimed and unwanted. It represents perhaps the largest unclaimed financial settlement in American legal history, and also one of the most profound statements about the difference between legal remedies and justice. The legal proceedings revealed the fundamental disconnect between American and Lakota concepts of ownership and value. American law was designed to handle disputes over property that could be bought and sold, traded and transferred, valued and compensated. It was not equipped to deal with relationships to land that were spiritual rather than economic, permanent rather than temporary, communal rather than individual. For the Lakota, the Black Hills were not property in any sense that American law could understand. They were not owned, they were inhabited. They were not valuable because of what could be extracted from them. They were valuable because of what they contained of history, spirituality, and cultural identity. They could not be replaced with money, because they were irreplaceable in any meaningful sense. The court cases dragged on through multiple generations of Lakota leadership, consuming enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources while producing virtually nothing in the way of practical relief. Lawyers grew old and died working on these cases. Judges retired and were replaced by new judges who had to familiarize themselves with decades of accumulated legal precedent and procedural complexity. Meanwhile, the Black Hills continued to be mined, developed, and transformed into something utterly different from the sacred landscape that had been protected by the original treaty. Mount Rushmore was carved into one of the most sacred peaks. Tourism replaced mining as the primary industry, but the fundamental violation remained. The land was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with Lakota culture or spirituality. The legal system seemed designed to exhaust the patience and resources of anyone seeking justice through official channels. Cases were delayed for procedural reasons, appealed on technical grounds, remanded to lower courts for additional consideration, and generally subjected to every form of bureaucratic delay that creative lawyers could devise. Government attorneys argued that too much time had passed for effective remedies, that the current occupants of the Black Hills had acquired rights through long occupation, that removing the existing population would cause more harm than allowing the status quo to continue. They portrayed the Lakota as unreasonable for refusing monetary compensation, as if there was something irrational about valuing sacred land more than cash settlements. The most frustrating aspect of the legal battle was how it transformed a clear case of treaty violation into an abstract academic exercise. Judges wrote lengthy opinions discussing the historical context of treaty making, the evolution of federal Indian law, and the competing claims of various parties, but somehow never managed to address the central question. If the government signs a treaty and then breaks it, shouldn't the remedy be to honour the original agreement? Instead, the legal system treated the case as if it were a complex property dispute between equal parties, rather than a situation where one party had used military force and political power to take what belonged to the other. The courts seemed determined to find some middle ground between justice and convenience, some compromise that would allow everyone to claim partial victory while avoiding the difficult task of actually enforcing the law. The Lakota found themselves trapped in a system that promised justice but delivered only delay, that acknowledged their rights but refused to enforce them, that admitted wrongdoing but offered only inadequate compensation. It was a perfect example of how legal systems can be used to legitimize injustice by wrapping it in procedures and precedents that make fundamental violations of right and wrong appear to be merely technical disagreements about competing claims. After more than a century of litigation, the Black Heels remain in the hands of people who have no legal right to them under the original treaty, while the money awarded as compensation remains unclaimed in federal accounts. The legal system has managed to acknowledge the injustice while perpetuating it, to admit the violation while refusing to remedy it. The faces persist in memory long after the names have faded. Those early American officials and negotiators who sat in lodge circles and spoke of lasting friendship between peoples. Some had kind eyes that seemed to light up when they learnt Lakota words or understood the significance of a particular ceremony. Others maintained a careful diplomatic distance, but projected genuine respect for the culture they were encountering. There was Colonel David Mitchell, who helped negotiate some of the early treaties and seemed genuinely moved by Lakota concepts of kinship and responsibility to future generations. He spent weeks learning about traditional governance structures, asking detailed questions about how decisions were made and how conflicts were resolved within Lakota society. He spoke often about his own grandchildren and expressed hope that they would grow up in a world where different peoples could coexist peacefully. General William Harney, despite his military background, surprised many Lakota leaders with his willingness to participate in traditional ceremonies and his apparent understanding of the spiritual dimensions of their relationship to the land. He was one of the few American officials who seemed to grasp that the Black Hills were not just territory to be managed, but sacred space that required a different kind of respect. Indian agent Thomas Fitzpatrick spent years living among various Plains tribes and developed what appeared to be genuine affection for the people he was supposed to be managing on behalf of the federal government. He learnt to speak passable Lakota, participated in social gatherings, and often advocated for tribal interests in his communications with Washington. He seemed to understand that his role was supposed to be protecting native rights, not just facilitating their surrender. Without words, he presided over rebellion. These men, and others like them, created relationships that felt real at the time. They shared meals, exchanged gifts, learned about each other's families and hopes for the future. Some brought their own children to meet Lakota families, as if they were building connections that would last across generations. A few even spoke about retiring in the area, about continuing their friendships after their official duties ended. The tragedy was not just the institutional betrayal of treaty obligations, but the personal betrayal of individual relationships that had seemed genuine. When the gold rush began and government enforcement of treaties became non-existent, these personal connections proved worthless against larger economic and political forces. Some of the men who had made the most solemn promises about permanent protection of Lakota territory were still alive and still working for the government when those promises were systematically violated. They had the opportunity to speak out, to resign in protest, to use their positions to advocate for treaty enforcement. Most chose silence and continued employment instead. A few did attempt to honor their personal commitments. Agent John McLaughlin continued to file reports documenting treaty violations and requesting military intervention to remove illegal miners. His requests were ignored, his reports were filed away, and he was eventually transferred to a different position, where he could cause less trouble for officials who preferred not to be reminded of inconvenient legal obligations. But most of the men who had sat in those lodge circles and made those heartfelt promises about lasting friendship simply disappeared into the bureaucracy when keeping their word became politically inconvenient. They took new assignments, accepted promotions, retired with full pensions, and generally managed to avoid any personal consequences for their role in one of the most comprehensive betrayals in American history. The Lakota leaders who had trusted them found themselves in the impossible position of trying to understand how people they had considered friends could abandon them so completely when friendship conflicted with career advancement. These had not been anonymous government officials carrying out impersonal policies. These had been individuals who had eaten at their tables, learned their language, expressed admiration for their culture, and made personal commitments about protecting their interests. Some Lakota elders spent years wondering if they had misunderstood something fundamental about American culture. Perhaps friendship meant something different to these people. Perhaps promises made in ceremonial contexts were not considered binding in the same way they would be in Lakota society. Perhaps the personal relationships they thought they had built were actually just professional performances designed to facilitate negotiations. The answer, as it became clear over time, was both simpler and more complicated than cultural misunderstanding. Some of the American officials had probably been sincere in their personal commitments, but sincerity proved worthless when it conflicted with institutional pressures and economic interests. The system they represented was stronger than their individual consciences, and most chose to serve the system rather than honor their personal promises. Others had probably been performing friendship as a negotiation tactic from the beginning, projecting warmth and respect as a way to build trust that could be exploited later. For these individuals, the betrayal was not a failure of character, but a successful completion of their assigned role in a process designed to separate native peoples from their land and resources. The most haunting aspect of the betrayal was how it poisoned not just political relationships, but personal memories. Lakota elders found themselves questioning every shared meal, every exchanged gift, every moment of apparent understanding. Had any of it been real? Had these men ever genuinely cared about Lakota welfare? Or had everything been calculated to achieve predetermined goals? The institutional betrayal of treaty obligations was devastating enough, but the personal betrayal of individual relationships added a dimension of emotional trauma that lasted for generations. It became difficult to trust any American official, no matter how sincere they appeared, because sincerity had proved to be such an unreliable predictor of actual behavior when pressure was applied. The faces in memory became symbols of something larger than individual character failures. They represented the capacity of decent people to participate in fundamentally indecent systems, the ability of institutional loyalties to override personal conscience, and the tragic gap between the promises people make in comfortable circumstances and the choices they make when those promises become inconvenient. In the end, the Lakota learned a lesson that many other peoples have learned throughout history, that individual relationships, no matter how warm and genuine they appear, are poor protection against systemic injustice, that institutional power, once deployed, can overwhelm personal conscience and transform friends into enemies without anyone making a conscious decision to betray their principles. The faces remain in memory not as reminders of friendship, but as warnings about the limitations of personal relationships in the face of institutional imperatives. They serve as evidence that good intentions and warm feelings are insufficient protection against systems designed to transfer wealth and power from those who have it to those who want it. And perhaps most importantly, they serve as reminders that trust, once broken on such a scale, becomes almost impossible to rebuild. When people discover that their most sacred relationships were actually just tactics in someone else's larger strategy, they learn to question everything and everyone, to look for hidden motives in every gesture of friendship, to assume that today's ally may become tomorrow's enemy if the incentives change. The Black Hills remain in the hands of people who have no legal right to them, the promised compensation remains unclaimed in federal accounts, and the faces of those early negotiators remain in memory as symbols of how completely trust can be betrayed and how little individual decency matters when institutional imperatives point in a different direction. Thank you for listening to another episode of Brutal History for Sleep. We hope this gentle journey through systematic governmental betrayal and cultural destruction has helped ease you into peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams, and remember, at least your problems probably don't involve having your sacred mountains carved into presidential faces without permission. The facts, because apparently reality needs footnotes. Well, now that you've hopefully drifted off to the soothing sounds of treaty violations and institutional betrayal, let's wake you back up with some tedious historical accuracy. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like a comprehensive fact-check of systematic governmental theft. Am I right? Here's what actually happened, in chronological order, for those who prefer their historical trauma neatly organized. In 1868, the United States government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota Nation, legally establishing the Great Sioux Reservation and specifically guaranteeing that the Black Hills would belong to the Lakota as long as the grass grows and the water flows. This wasn't just a handshake deal. It was ratified by the US Senate and carried the full force of federal law. The treaty negotiations took months, with Lakota leaders carefully reviewing every clause and boundary description to ensure they understood exactly what was being promised. For about 6 years, the arrangement worked reasonably well. The Lakota maintained their traditional way of life within the reservation boundaries, while American settlers and military personnel generally respected the established lines. There were occasional tensions and minor incidents, but nothing that couldn't be resolved through proper diplomatic channels and the existing legal framework. Then came 1874, and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's reconnaissance expedition into the Black Hills, an expedition that just happened to include civilian miners and geologists whose real job was confirming rumors about gold deposits. When Custer's team discovered substantial amounts of gold and publicized their findings in American newspapers, everything changed overnight. The headlines screamed about fortunes waiting to be claimed, and suddenly those sacred peaks weren't sacred anymore. They were just another mining opportunity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Approximately 15,000 people flooded into the Black Hills between 1875 and 1877, creating entire cities like Deadwood and Lead seemingly overnight. These weren't just a few scattered prospectors. This was a full-scale invasion that violated every provision of the 1868 treaty. The Lakota reported these illegal incursions to federal officials, reminding them of their legal obligations to remove trespassers and protect tribal territory. The government's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic creativity. Officials acknowledged the violations but claimed they lacked sufficient military resources to enforce the treaty. Internal documents later revealed this was false. Adequate troops were available, but were being deployed elsewhere for other purposes. The decision not to enforce the treaty was political, not practical. Meanwhile, military commanders who were supposed to remove illegal miners somehow kept getting lost on the way to mining camps, and prosecutors, who were supposed to file charges against trespassers, discovered their offices were suddenly understaffed. When it became clear that the Lakota would not voluntarily sell the Black Hills, they refused multiple offers worth millions of dollars, explaining that sacred land was not for sale at any price. The government simply stopped pretending to enforce the treaty. The illegal mining operations grew into permanent settlements, complete with municipal governments and business districts, all operating openly on land that legally belonged to the Lakota Nation. In 1877, Congress passed legislation formally annexing the Black Hills, but this act violated constitutional requirements for treaty modification and therefore lacked legal validity. The Lakota were essentially told that their sacred homeland had been taken, and they could either accept it or face military action. Most tribal leaders, recognizing the impossibility of armed resistance against the US military, reluctantly agreed to relocate to smaller reservations. The legal battle that followed lasted over a century. Case after case wound through federal courts, with the Lakota consistently arguing that the taking of the Black Hills violated both the original treaty and the Fifth Amendment's protection against government seizure of private property without just compensation. The cases were delayed for procedural reasons, appealed on technical grounds, and generally subjected to every form of bureaucratic obstruction that creative government lawyers could devise. Finally, in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians that the taking of the Black Hills did indeed violate the Fifth Amendment. However, instead of ordering the land returned, the court decided that monetary compensation was the appropriate remedy. The Lakota were awarded $17,500,000 0 cents for the 1877 value of the Black Hills plus interest, totaling approximately $106 million 0 cents. The Lakota response was immediate and unequivocal. They refused the money. The Black Hills were not for sale in 1877, and they were not for sale in 1980. The awarded compensation has remained in federal accounts ever since, earning interest and growing to over $1 billion while remaining unclaimed and unwanted. It represents perhaps the largest unclaimed financial settlement in American legal history, and also one of the most profound statements about the difference between legal remedies and actual justice. Today, the Black Hills remain in the hands of people who have no legal title to them under the original treaty, which has never been legally abrogated. The land generates hundreds of millions in tourism revenue annually, particularly from Mount Rushmore, which was carved into what the Lakota consider one of their most sacred peaks, without tribal consultation or consent. Meanwhile, the Lakota Nation continues to assert its sovereignty claims and refuse monetary settlements, maintaining that some things are worth more than money, and that justice delayed is justice denied. The estimated value of resources extracted from the Black Hills since 1877, including gold, silver, uranium, and other minerals, runs into the tens of billions of dollars in contemporary terms. None of this wealth has been shared with the legal owners of the land, creating one of the most economically significant, uncompensated takings in American history. So there you have it, a soothing bedtime story about how forever turned out to mean until we find something shiny, and how the phrase, as long as the grass grows and the water flows, apparently came with an asterisk that read, terms and conditions subject to change based on mineral content. Sleep tight, and try not to think about how many other permanent promises might have similar hidden clauses.